Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of year again. Mass production for the next generation iPhone hasn't started, which means any leak can be believable, and we get to say it's far enough off that, oh yeah, it could happen, it's possible. So, fourth time in a row, will the notch get smaller this year? Let's begin. First of all, just who the crap cares at this point? I mean, Apple has clearly shown they can dominate the smartphone industry with the exact same size notch year after year after year. And I also think it's hilarious that Android companies kind of went to a notchless design and then backed off from it because they realized no one really cared about punch holes in the first place. I still remember reviewing the OnePlus 7 Pro, which didn't have a camera hole or a notch, but it did have a pop-up camera, which for a while I thought might be a durability concern, but in the long term haven't realized that many issues with it. And they of course brought the camera hole back, and they've kept it ever since. Even on the OnePlus 9 it still has it, because little dots or little notches in the top part of our screens don't make a huge difference on how we use our phone, because that's the part of the screen we look at the very least. Not to say that it wouldn't be cool if they found a way to embed the cameras underneath the display in a way that didn't compromise on the camera quality or the display quality too much. As of right now, it seems like you kind of have to compromise pretty heavily on both to make a under display camera work, but it's almost obvious at this point. Eventually it will get better, eventually it will improve, and that's likely what everybody's gonna go forward with. But time and time again, I'm seeing a lot of you guys comment that you actually like the notch, or you prefer it because it gives the iPhone somewhat of a iconic look and helps you remember the right way to hold the phone. And with that, there has been a leak from a company called iRepair, which is probably looking for free publicity by releasing this stuff, or they were contacted by someone who was contacted by someone, and the sources go all the way back up the chain. But Mac Rumors reported on it, and they showed these different glass casings that have a somewhat smaller notch, and it basically takes the approach I'd been suggesting for years, but I kind of never got in my way, so I somewhat gave up on the idea. But essentially, without having to combine any sensors or having to drop any of Face ID's secureness, you could embed the earpiece in between the glass and the metal chassis of the iPhone, which is what lots of other smartphones have been doing in recent years, and essentially reduce the notch size by a little bit. But now actually seeing the leak itself, may I just add that even if this is real, which honestly, because mass production for the iPhone 13 hasn't really started yet, it is totally plausible for this to be fake. In fact, pretty late into the mass production season last year, we were still getting a lot of leakers and a lot of people saying that, oh yeah, notch is going to get smaller. Definitely expect the notch to shrink, especially on the 12 mini, because that's what these leaks are saying, that's what the reports are saying, and of course didn't happen. So we have many months of fake notch leaks to go through before we actually get to the official launch, in which, in my opinion, the notch will still be the same size as it is today, because Apple knows that if they did shrink the notch by ever so slightly 2.5 microns like they are in these leaked images, average consumer is not going to notice or care. In fact, I would argue most of the tech community would not even notice or care if this is what next generation iPhones look like. If they still have the same squared off design, they still have lightning, they still got the centered Apple logo and a big old camera bump on the back, then this notch I don't really see changing much. I mean, I know you guys want more widgets stuffed into the top of your display, but I feel like if Apple wanted to add the battery percentage back, they would have done it by now. And with all that extra space they're allowing for, I can only imagine them wanting to bring back the carrier name permanently in the top part of your display, which honestly, I don't miss those days. So hopefully they make that optional. I mean, best case scenario, this just allows them to keep the battery percentage on at all times, and then we call it a day and they don't bring back the carrier name. But to me, it seems like a massive rework and a lot of retooling that Apple would have to adjust in all of their mass production facilities for something that would not make a huge difference. Average consumers would not be able to tell a difference between the size of the notch unless you put them side by side and said which one was smaller, but I guarantee you that's not what most people are gonna do here. And the tech community, if you're annoyed with having a notch, this is still a notch. I mean, if Apple was like legally required and enforced by several governments to be like, you must shrink the notch, to me, this is like the most bare minimum attempt Apple could give to be like, see, we technically shrunk the notch. It's a little bit smaller, even though for the past few months we've been listening to all these leakers say that the notch wouldn't be shrinking in width, but in height, and we would get this somewhat minimal notch that always looked weird in all the renders to me. It didn't look like something Apple would do, and it's such a minor change that that's what makes me think Apple is not interested in doing this. And I don't know who's creating these things, but something tells me they're pretty easy to duplicate, because we've seen all kinds of, you know, from the factory notch leaks before that end up not really happening. And frankly, after last year, I was completely convinced that if Apple was going to shrink the notch, this was the year to do it, because they were releasing a 5.4-inch iPhone and the display was going to be drastically smaller than the iPhone 10, and there was no way you could keep that same size notch on a phone this small, so they were going to have to shrink the notch, at least for the mini iPhone. Maybe they keep the same size notch for the rest of the lineup, but at least the mini one had to have a smaller one. And of course, I was wrong, and we were all getting super excited because the smaller iPhone had to have a smaller notch, but turns out at the end of the day, they can just shrink the widgets in the corners, and the display ears, as we call them on the iPhone 12 mini, are very small, but they can just scale down the font and fit everything up there, which in all of our concepts and renders, we were like, no, see, you can't fit the cellular widget in the time and the battery icon up there, so they have to shrink the notch for that software thing. We're kind of stupid if you think about it that way. It was such an easy fix for Apple to be like, oh yeah, no, notch is staying the same size, despite tons of videos saying, oh no, the notch might be gone next year, the notch might be shrunk. And I feel like it's the boy who cried wolf situation of like, oh, maybe this time, maybe this time, maybe this time, and then it just never happens. So my personal guess is that Apple is very comfortable with the notch, and they understand the average consumer does not care about it. Even if Apple miraculously found a way to remove it entirely this year, it would not attract that many eyes, and the average user would not really pay attention to that unless, of course, you do a side-by-side. But I see notchless phones in commercials all the time, and they never really catch that many people's attention. It's not really a wow factor. It's just a, oh yeah, there used to be a cutout there, now there isn't, huh? But even that I don't think would get a bunch of people to upgrade, because you get used to using a phone without a notch very, very quickly, as I did with the OnePlus 7 Pro, and when you go back to a phone with a notch, you get used to it very quickly once again. So my prediction is that Apple is keeping the notch in its current size and its current layout until they find a way to remove it completely. And even if they find a way to remove it completely, Android will have probably been doing it on their phones for many, many years. So the idea that Apple will somehow skip over all of these Android phone companies that don't even produce phones at the same scale that Apple does, they're clearly going to be doing this first and be doing it for a while. And once Apple finds a way to iron it out and make it more reliable and seamless and affordable at mass production, that's when Apple will actually implement it, which I still think is years away. So this video could age horribly. That does happen on this channel from time to time, but personally, I call baloney on these notch leaks. I think notch is sticking around, same size as last year, but it would be fun to be proven wrong. So feel free to let me know what you think is going to happen down below. This is your Apple Shape here. I'll see you guys in the next one.